is an assistant head teacher at Sandringham High School in Hertfordshire, and I actually met Caroline, I want to say September of 2013 in Istanbul. We were both there for a conference, and we were at the same session, and we got chatting afterwards. And I was just so blown away, not obviously as her as an individual, but the fact that a teacher from England was at an international, and well, as it was, a European conference. And I was so impressed by the fact, A, she was there, but also that her school had sort of sponsored this and allowed her time out, and I presume helped pay for it and things like that. I don't know about that, we'll ask her later. And I was just blown away by this, and also when we got chatting as well about the work that was going on in Sandringham High School, the research that was going on, the learning communities that were going on. And I know for our students, some of them are here today from the Sussex Research Network, our research leaders, they're engaging in the sorts of things that Caroline did a couple of years ago and is probably still engaging and struggling with today. And so hopefully there'll be questions with regard to that as well. So Caroline's not only been doing stuff locally at her school, she's also been doing stuff nationally as well. And she's going to be speaking to that today for Evidence for the Frontline, which is a project that involves the Education Endowment Foundation. And again, Caroline will speak more to that. But it's so impressive to be working at such a national scale. And also she's been a sort of key participant in the research at Ed. I like to refer to it as a movement because I feel it's more of a movement, the way it sort of got up to speed so quickly. So Caroline can speak to not only sort of the local research and research at the grassroots level by teachers, but also more about the national picture as well. So I really, it's my pleasure to welcome you, Caroline, and thank you very much. And I look forward also to not only your talk, but the discussions afterwards. Thank you.
Well, that's a very generous introduction. But yeah, it was 2 years ago that we met. And I must say, Gillian, as you know, was the friendliest person I met at this conference. So I was very daunted going to a conference of academics when I was just a teacher. But I actually felt very much at home, and obviously we've developed a relationship since, which has been invaluable. So I'll just introduce my presentation and explain the kind of themes that I'm going to cover. If I don't cover the kind of thing that you're interested in, then obviously please do ask me questions at the end, and I'll do my very best to answer them. Yes, okay, so about me, that's quite a hideously large photograph, just in case you can't see my face. That's what I look like. Maybe a few years ago, I might be a bit thinner then. But anyway, so yes, I am an assistant head teacher at a secondary school. It's a comprehensive mixed school in Hertfordshire. I'm also a part-time doctoral student at the University of Cambridge, and I feel guilty every time I say that because I really need to finish my thesis. It's nearly there, I promise. And my subject that I teach is business and economics. I've been a teacher for about 10 years or so, and I love doing that. So what am I going to talk about this evening? I thought what I would do to start off with is just to make clear to you about my values and my experiences of research and how it's influenced my role. I think it's always quite good to sort of lay out your kind of interests, experiences, and your values. Ever the reflective practitioner. And what I thought I would share with you, secondly, are just some steps, and I say steps, towards evidence-informed practice at my school. I don't think we're the finished article, but it is kind of an extra step each academic year. I'll briefly mention Evidence for the Frontline that Gillian's referred to, which is a national project supported by the Education Endowment Foundation. And then I will talk about and reflect on lessons learned along the way. So what's been difficult, how I might have overcome things that I'm still struggling with. So I suppose just to be really clear about why I sort of spend quite a lot of my time engaging in this kind of work when it's not necessarily always part of my job description, but I have tried to make it part of it. I studied for a part-time master's in education between 2009 and 2011. I've been teaching for 4 years up to that point. So it's in my 5th and 6th year of teaching. And it was genuinely transformative. I think that the work that I did changed my perspective as a teacher and as a potential school leader. And it also gave me confidence in myself that I could get better at writing, I could get better at reading, academic texts, etc. So it was quite important for me. In terms of the actual focus of my work, I worked with a small group of teachers. They were all engaging in a teacher leadership project, which was supported through the University of Cambridge, where they ran a 1 year or came up with a 1 year project, almost like a mini master's, but it wasn't a master's project. They created a portfolio at the end of it, which documented their journey of change and how they're improving teaching and learning for themselves and their colleagues. And what was really interesting about that project is I tried to enhance the provision and teachers' perceptions of the impact they were having, was that teachers didn't see themselves as leaders, even though what I could see and the evidence of what they were doing was genuinely quite transformative, whether it be to a small group of teachers or a larger group of teachers. But yet, because they didn't possess a formal leadership title, they didn't consider themselves a leader. So part of my work in the subsequent year, when I was carrying out my action research project, was to support them to realise their influence and support them to think about the impact they could have in order to support them to be ambitious and realistic about what could be achieved. I think what it taught me, and I've drawn a couple of diagrams here, is that it taught me really about what leadership is and where it comes from. So the top diagram is like a traditional sort of hierarchical structure, and the one at the bottom might be more of a network where actually you might have somebody that might not be at the top of the hierarchy in an organisation, but can have significant influence because of what they know, because of what they can do, etc. And I'm sure those of you more learned than myself about leadership theory and authority, I'm sure that might resonate with you. But it really made me think about people within a school and the capacity, I think, within all teachers to have an impact. It particularly taught me, I would say, about self-efficacy and how self-efficacy is a really strong determining factor of what teachers are able to do in the classroom or in terms of leadership. And if they have a strong sense of self-efficacy, that can be quite transformative. And I would say that's, you know, although that was some years ago now, I am now a school leader, it's certainly altered the lens with which I see staff within my school. Since I've been a school leader, I have been engaged in a part-time doctorate where I am looking at the identity of teachers across my whole school and whether the professional learning opportunities, or CPD, within my school can actually impact on teachers' identities or not. Okay, teachers' identities are obviously very multifaceted, and what influences them is very multidimensional. But I have been looking at the extent to which the nature of CPD that teachers engage in can influence them, and it's given me some insights about autonomy, teachers' insights as well, the profile that teachers' learning and knowledge actually has within a school, and actually I found that to be quite important. We have created a journal where annually teachers write about their practice, they write about what they've learned. And this quotation here, which you may not be up to read, I'll just read it for you, says, "The learning journal is a great move forward to get people to think of themselves as professionals and academics again." And that's obviously just one quotation from one of the interviews I carried out, but it was really interesting from my point of view that teachers, of all the opportunities that were developed within the school, that's really an initiative that really took off. Teachers liked having the opportunity to reflect on their practice. They were given no time, no extra money to do it, but it's become part of the culture of our school that we do reflect on practice, and that actually teachers writing about what they know has got quite an important status. So as you can imagine, I've learned a lot about professionalism and teacher learning. And then just finally, I suppose because of all of that, I'm very much interested in teacher learning. It has really influenced my practice as a teacher. I think I'm much more likely now to pick up a book about, you know, memory or assessment that would be evidence informed compared to genuinely probably what I would have picked up in my first or second year. So I actually think my practice as a teacher has improved because I've just found it rather useful. And I'm sure you know this quote, but if I've seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. So I do genuinely feel that my knowledge and my practice has been enriched by engaging with and in the academic education community, I think my teaching's better and I think my leadership's better. I'm not saying it's great, but I think it's better than it was. And so therefore, I'm very open and proactive in terms of engaging with anything that will connect schools and the academic community. So that's a bit about me. So hopefully I've tried to give an honest account of where I've come from in terms of the value of education research to me. And so what I'm going to do now is just share a few kind of practical things that we've been doing at Sandringham recently that have been evidence informed. We've done probably more things than I'm going to talk about. These are probably the most recent ones. So again, if you've got questions, please don't hesitate to ask at the end. So the first one is about our continuous professional development. So over the last couple of years, I've done quite a lot of work in this area as part of my doctoral study. And so we've got to the point now with CPD where I feel like it's been on a journey and it has improved. And last year we were quite influenced by the What Makes Great Teaching report that came out from the Sutton Trust, written by Rob Coe et al. And in which they identified, based on the research evidence that they looked at, sort of 6 main features of effective teaching. And we were very much influenced by that. But I think what's quite important is within a school that we look at research, but we also marry it with our own experience as well. So what we did is we engaged in a process of trying to identify what we thought were the really important aspects of what makes great teaching. And indeed, in terms of so we engaged the whole teacher community in this process. So we had surveys, we had focus groups. There was quite an iterative process of trying to narrow it down. We did end up with 6. We didn't actually intend to come up with 6 because that was the number in the report, but we ended up with 6, and some definitely overlap. So subject knowledge came out really strongly, and I think reflecting on practice in our school, I think that's something we'd overlooked. We just assumed teachers knew what they were teaching, but actually with the curriculum change and various teachers' routes into teaching, because they're so varied, I would say, compared to what they were 10 years ago, I don't think that's something we could be as secure on as we might have been in the past. So we identified 6 areas, including, for example, subject knowledge, that we decided were actually really, really key to great teaching and were the building blocks. And then from there, we've developed a training program, which comprises of kind of one-off aspects with kind of key readings and key aspects of practice that we share, but also we've turned it into a development program where teachers pick one and develop it over a year. They have to reflect on their goals, their interventions, and then they use evidence throughout the year in order to reflect on whether they've actually developed practice in that area. So we're sort of incorporating or being inspired by the evidence in this area, but also we're trying to support teachers to be reflective in terms of deciding whether what they're doing is having impact. So that's new for this year, as you can see. So I'm very excited about how it goes, and we're going to start that on November the 2nd. So another thing that's been quite useful, I would say, in our community is something called a think tank, which, to be honest, isn't dissimilar to kind of a meeting series like the one we're in now. The idea being that we connect with researchers or teachers from other schools. I don't know about you, but I think that it's very easy to get caught up in a bubble of the school in which you work, and I find that. And very quickly you can become institutionalized, and it can be quite hard to appreciate that there is another way to do things because of just the rapid pace of even a school day. It's quite fast paced, lots of things to do. So we developed something which we call the think tank, which is just simply a termly meeting where we invited an academic, or sometimes it was a teacher from another school, to talk to us. This was often via Skype. Because obviously of the practical barriers. And this was an example that we had last year, probably about this time last year, or December last year. So one of our big school focuses was about feedback. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be great to have an expert talk to us? So we had Steve Higgins, talk to us, which was really nice. There wasn't like loads of teachers, probably 10 or 15 teachers, but each of them had the opportunity to ask really specific questions about, you know, how can I feedback more effectively at Key Stage 3 in religious studies? Well, what about me? I teach A-level geography and I've got students who keep repeating mistakes. How can I use feedback to stop that? So that was really nice. And I think just again, although it's maybe not as transformative and it's not kind of in teachers' everyday lives, I think the notion and the fact that it's regular, it's become part of our school. This year we've introduced a book group, which I know loads of schools have, but we haven't actually had one up till now. The texts that we're looking at this year, we've decided on these. They're not necessarily the most academic, but they are focused on education. And for me, I see this year as a trial. We'll just have one book a term. It's a voluntary exercise. It's relatively inexpensive, so my business manager isn't too annoyed at me, but I see that sort of morphing maybe next year into a journal club, or maybe have a book then a journal, etc. But again, introducing systems and kind of a culture where reading is celebrated and is a part of our school life. So what we do have is we have had several teachers do master's programs, which is obviously, you know, quite a big investment for anybody doing one in terms of your personal life. Managing that is quite high commitment. So we've developed a program in our school called Research Advocates, which we've shared across our teaching school, part of the Teaching School Alliance, the Auburn TSA, and we've developed a program which is simply 4 sessions long. And we've got a local researcher. He runs the physics PGCE at Hertfordshire and at Cambridge University, and he basically introduces teachers to educational research, kind of the extent of it, you know, what's the journal, what's peer review, etc., what's the EEF toolkit. So he introduces teachers to different forms of research and evidence, gives them opportunities to actually have a look at it, supports them to identify what might be of interest to them. They return to a second session where teachers are then directed to specific forms of research that might be relevant for them. And then they're supported to reflect on the implications that might have for their practice. And then they return to a third and then a fourth session to think about how their practice could be and might have been influenced by that evidence. So it's an opportunity for teachers to dip their toe into the world of research. It's not particularly taxing, but it certainly opens eyes. And over 4 afternoons, it's not a significant time commitment either. But that's been pretty successful. And we ran it last year, and we've got quite a few teachers in our school and in other schools that are keen to do it this year. I'll just briefly mention this. So Gillian mentioned it at the beginning. So Evidence for the Front Line is a service that has been designed to connect teachers to researchers. So if they have particular questions or areas of interest that they want to know if there's any evidence about, they can access this site, ask a question, and it will be answered by a researcher. Now, it is funded by the Education Endowment Foundation, and we are in kind of it's not a RCT, but we're sort of undergoing a 1-year trial of it. It's only open to 32 schools nationally, about half primary, half secondary, across the country, from Tyne and Wear down to Devon. And the University of York and Sandringham School are leading this together. And we're essentially acting as brokers. As teachers ask questions, we might direct them to researchers or to research that might be relevant. And for me, this is quite an important project. Where it will go in the future, I don't know. But for me, I think it's kind of the missing link, because I don't think that there's necessarily a secure infrastructure that connects schools to researchers. I think the network that you have here is extraordinary and really useful. You know, personally speaking, my own personal link with Gillian has been invaluable over the last couple of years in terms of my practice and supporting other teachers in my school. But I feel lucky to have had that opportunity, and I don't think it's necessarily, you know, systematic or available for everyone, despite how helpful people are. So I think, for me, I think this is potentially quite useful, and I'll be really interested to see the outcomes at the end of the year. And it looks like that. You can kind of go online, it's just evidenceofthefrontline.com, and have a look, but unfortunately you can't log in, but it's got some information about the project. And then I suppose, and that's just question answer, for example. But I would say that Gillian refers already to research ed. I've certainly experienced in the last couple of years in particular just a wealth of fantastic opportunities that are available in the education, you know, across the education landscape that have been really invaluable. So research ed is one of them. So it started a couple of years ago, and so far my engagement with it has been kind of attending annual conferences. So there's been 2013, 14, I suppose 3 now. Yeah, there's been 3 annual conferences, and then there's offshoots as well. So there are regional conferences. So the annual ones are in London, regional ones, and then they set up a conference series which is for research leads specifically, and I went to that in March. That was in Cambridge, and that was really interesting because it was kind of full of people a bit like me. Some of them might have had formal research lead titles within their school, or there were people like me who were just a bit keen about research and wanted to support teachers in their school. And it was really interesting listening to the presentations. So I would encourage anybody to engage with that network. It's really useful. They have a very useful website. They share quite a lot of the presentations. They have kind of research digests. It's really good. Google Scholar, I just think it's really useful. And I was taught a hack recently that if you search with PDF at the end, you'll be more likely to access free papers as opposed to those behind paywalls. You know, just I have to say, like, Twitter has been very invaluable. There's definitely a community of teachers that are engaged with research, and academics that are engaged with practicing teachers and education, and everybody seems to kind of so freely share their insights and their wisdom about how they might have applied an idea in their classroom and how it maybe did work or didn't work, or, you know, the dialogue between you know, researchers and teachers is fantastic. And then you get useful blogs, like I've just done a screenshot there of Tom Sherrington's blog. So he's a head teacher in North London, and he was just sharing insights about contemporary kind of educational ideas and research that he would want all his staff to know. And I just found that, you know, a useful source of information. And then, of course, I always think that asking the question, can you help me, you know, whether that's via email to an academic or a teacher in another school, I would say teachers and academics have always been really helpful because, well, I don't know, because they're great people and they want to share their knowledge. So I think that's been really useful. And recently I was sent a chapter from a paper. This is just an email just about something that I was reading about, and I just found that really useful. And personally speaking, it will help me when I'm finishing my thesis over half term. Wow, so I've kind of run through quite a few things so far. So just to recap, the value of research to me, some of the steps, some of the kind of practical things that I've done at school, and then I've touched on evidence to the front line. So finally, I just want to round off with some of the lessons I've learned along the way, and what that really means is what's hard and how far I've got in overcoming those difficulties. And these might be familiar with you. So one of them is time. So essentially, I would say that finding the time, or it's not finding the time, you never find the time, making the time to reflect on the extent to which the work that you do in school is evidence informed can be a challenge. Reading up takes time, and it can be quite difficult. I suppose what I've done in this area is I've really tried to think about people and opportunities. So in terms of people, I've really thought about, compared to say 2 years ago, when I think I was doing quite a lot of this work on my own as like a single person in the school, what I've tried to do is just be a bit more careful and probably a bit more clever about thinking about teachers within my school that have an interest in this area and expertise and knowledge and will. Because what I found is that teachers who might have done a master's, might be doing a master's, might have an interest or might want to dip their toe can actually be really, really supportive. Firstly, they can obviously help to lead things. So when I was going through some examples, our Research Advocates programme is not run by me. It's run by a teacher who used to work with a science learning centre and is very much very experienced in terms of educational research. And she's been absolutely invaluable, which is fantastic. So selfishly, that saved me some time. Like, we worked together in terms of planning the objectives and how things are going, but she leads it. So that does save me time. However, she loves it. So that gives her a really, really good opportunity to develop her passion for educational research. And that's been really useful. And there are other teachers that have been involved and supportive in that way. I think as well, in terms of time, it can be easy to think, right, we want maybe to engage teachers more, let's add a meeting or another forum or another thing, and that can take up teachers' time and it can take up your own time, and that can be tricky when you've got books to mark and lessons to plan and the general kind of day-to-day of teaching. So I think thinking about the existing processes that are in place, the existing structures that are in place within a school is really important. So for example, I'd say 2 years ago, the CPD kind of offer in my school wasn't necessarily evidence informed, but now I'm confident that it is more evidence informed. So I'm kind of using a system that is already within my school and thinking about how that can be improved. And that's obviously quite useful because it's within time that teachers are already spending. I would say that I don't really think like this, but I think maybe there might be a perception that engaging with evidence and with academia, you know, involves a lot of kind of pondering and thinking very grand thoughts about things. My experience is probably more like this, where, you know, from time to time I just find it really difficult, or I might be trying to read up about something, and maybe because I'm not an expert, I actually find it quite hard, and I read a paper and I just don't get some of the stats. I can understand the conclusion, the abstract, but I find it quite difficult. I think I was at a conference recently, and Claire Hood, who's at the Samuel Whitbread Academy in Bedfordshire, she's their research lead. She said, when I walk around school, people kind of ask me questions as if I'm a walking library of educational research. And I kind of feel like that sometimes, not completely, but sometimes people ask me a question and expect me to know, and then you kind of feel this pressure of like, oh God, I've got to be an expert on everything. And that's where the capacity of, you know, thinking about staff that are interested and can kind of field some of those ideas and questions is quite important. So I suppose if someone was looking to kind of develop practice in this area and they're finding it hard, I would rather unhelpfully just say, I think that might be normal. But it's also quite rewarding. Anyway. I would say that strategically, I think it's quite important to engage one's head teacher. I am an assistant head teacher, and I think I have been an assistant head teacher for just 3 years. And I think before I became an assistant head, you know, I kind of had this idea that I would have a lot of influence. And I think I do have influence. However, I think that there are so many activities and priorities that go on within a school. You know, like this morning I was in a staff briefing and there were kind of various announcements from people, and somebody made an announcement about house events that were going on after school and were asking for teachers to attend. So it's like a musical house event. Somebody else was saying, right, your year 10 report's due on Thursday. Someone else was announcing something else. It's very easy to see how congested a teacher's working day and their working life ultimately is, with lots of messages saying this is important, that's important. I think what head teachers say, though, can cut through, and certainly in my interviews with teachers, I've really learnt that the kinds of things that they say or they can describe about priorities from the leadership team tend to have come from what the head teacher said rather than a deputy or assistant head. Now, I'm sure this will vary in lots of different schools, but I think if a head teacher thinks that evidence-informed practice or research is important, I think that can be helpful. So alliance building, relationship building with your head teacher about the value of this, I think can be quite important, and kind of a supportive comment in a meeting, or a teacher really engaging with this and getting into it, I think it is really helpful. So I would encourage people to engage proactively with their head teachers. Yes, I suppose this is a bit of wisdom, really. So I think it can be quite difficult to change any organisation, and I think if you want to support your school to become more research informed, I suppose one needs to accept that change can't happen overnight, and that you can't necessarily change everything straight away. And it's about kind of accepting that and thinking about, well, what is practical? What is within my sphere of influence? Who can I work with to make this happen? And perhaps not beating oneself up if maybe there might be practice within a school that goes completely against evidence and maybe isn't that effective. But, I suppose that's just wisdom. And I think ultimately that's whatever steps you take are useful. And I suppose I feel that the steps that have been taken in my school over the past couple of years have definitely been worth taking. Sometimes they haven't always been that successful, and there are some things we started and we evaluated and thought, no, I don't think that's right. But I think every opportunity is a learning opportunity, and I think it's important to make that step, to think about it, because I think it does help us move forward. Yes, so I'd encourage anybody to at least take the first step and to think about it. So I think that might be it. Thank you very much. I feel I have talked for ages, but if you've got any questions, I would love to hear them.
Caroline, hi Caroline, my name's Rebecca. I'm a lecturer here in the Department of Education, but I'm very new to this. I only finished my PhD last year.
Congratulations.
Well, I didn't mean to say that, but so I sort of still feel as though I'm quite near to teaching. It doesn't feel that long ago. I loved listening to you, and it felt really generous, and I love that sort of sense of the way in which it gives us that importance of teachers as researchers, lying at the heart of that. One of the things that I was really intrigued by, my research is qualitative, and there seemed to be some assumptions that you were making about what is research, and I wondered what is the place of qualitative research, and maybe, heaven forbid, research that's very much about sort of raising problematics that aren't necessarily that easily solved, but they come the sort of firing points of sort of discussion, and we don't quite know. We've sort of peeled back the layers of the onion, but we're not going to solve it this minute.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm now feeling I haven't been very, Anyway, I will try and clarify kind of what I mean by research. So, it's really interesting, actually, for me on the journey that I've been in particular, because when I did my own master's and when I was looking at that initial group of teachers, it was all very much around practice development. It was very much informed by experience, by reflection, by obviously reading and drawing upon the literature about teacher development, about leadership, for example. But in terms of the research that I was doing, it was entirely, there were some surveys and things like that, but probably in terms of what informed my conclusions, more often than not, was qualitative research. And I think because of that, in terms of the kind of areas that we've looked at in school to develop, although some have been informed by quantitative research, in terms of engaging teachers with their practice, we are supporting teachers to kind of pose questions about their practice. So one of the things that I shared was the sort of Sandringham 6 development programme. And so when teachers start that on November the 2nd, it will be, well, what matters to you? What is the specific class that you're concerned about with respect to your classroom climate or your subject knowledge? And tell me a bit more about that and what might you do? So I think that in terms of the kind of nature of how we support teachers, it's very much around kind of raising problems and raising questions and supporting them to think about evidence that might help them, whether that's come from an academic source or whether that's evidence that they're drawing upon from their own classrooms, and that more often than not might be qualitative. It might be quantitative insofar as teachers might examine kind of assessment outcomes over time and think about the impact there. So I would say probably my kind of grounding is more qualitative. I would say that the evidence for the Frontline project, which is sponsored by the Education Endowment Foundation, we are looking at research that has been published more often than not with a quantitative kind of statistical confidence behind it. And that's been quite interesting. We are drawing upon that type of research. And I don't know, this probably sounds like sitting on the fence, but I think we can learn a lot from both. I think that what's interesting about, I don't know, if we take the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, for example, effect sizes, or you know, John Hattie's work, which is widely cited, I think that it can point to interesting and promising areas of practice. But as Gert Biester says, you know, it points to what has worked and maybe not what will work. And I think the nuance involved in applying things in practice, just so specific, like what we found was really useful about our think tank discussion with Steve Higgins about feedback was we knew that feedback is powerful, but you know, what does feedback look like, you know, when you're teaching French to, you know, 12-year-olds versus what does feedback look like when you're teaching economics to, you know, 18-year-olds. So I think that what can be really powerful there are qualitative studies or more qualitative accounts of teacher practice, because I think they can support the translation from kind of quantitative research into practice, because ultimately, although there is a debate about what is research and what is evidence, I think we're all, well, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I would say we're all looking for what will enhance practice in the classroom so that student outcomes are improved. And I think you need to draw upon all the sort of methodological traditions in order to most effectively support teachers to change practice.
Thank you. I'm just going to walk to the back of the room, Rob, and then I'll be back to you, and then here.
Hello, yes, I'm Claire Tyson from Homewood School in Kent. I'm a teacher researcher. We've been using a lot of mixed methodology because most school projects are unique and specific to that context. So you draw on the literature and the national, the big quantitative studies, but then you have to, as you say, translate and apply it. So we've done a lot of work with mixed methodology where we'll look at the data, we'll look at the students, we'll do questionnaires, and we'll combine that either in a final analysis or steps along the way. And that's been very, it's helped us be more rigorous about our research, but still trying to maintain the local knowledge as well. So that's been good.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that, you know, the phrase that you use there, the local knowledge, I think is really, really powerful. I think that perhaps kind of research knowledge and research literacy, you know, isn't as kind of deep as it could be, maybe within schools. However, I still think probably, you know, well, I don't know, this is a guess, but I would say that teachers might be, you know, quite aware of things on the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, for example, that have been derived from sort of statistical or quantitative research, whereas the knowledge that exists within teachers' own minds or within their colleagues' classrooms can quite often be tacit. And I think there is definitely a job to do to support teachers to think kind of proactively and more consciously about their practice and to document that. And I think that's really powerful, particularly to other teachers who are trying to do a similar thing. So any kind of frameworks to enable teachers to think and to reflect and document what they're doing, and, you know, any kind of tentative conclusions about, well, what the impact might have been. Although we may not be very secure about those conclusions because it's quite small scale, I think sharing those and communicating those to other teachers, I think, has got quite a lot of potential.
Thank you. My name's Robert Rosenthal. I work here at the university. And thank you for your wonderful talk. What I'd like to ask you is what do you do at Sandringham to, if you like, monitor and prove the case of the impact of the research and culture you're developing on pupil attainment? Whether it's something that happens on an individual teacher basis, in which case do you have some sort of template of approach that you ask people to follow, or whether you are doing something school-wide? Because I think the point of my question is that people often say, well, it all sounds very good, but how do we know it works? So I'm just really interested to know if there's anything in place at Sandringham to be able to prove the case for the importance of what you're doing.
Sure, that's a great question, and one that my head teacher says all the time. So I have been really thinking about how to do that. Now, I don't have a perfect answer, but I can share with you a bit of a journey that we've been on. So last year what we did was so during some teachers' inset or CPD time, teachers were developing their practice on a specific theme chosen by them from kind of a menu of options. And what we asked them to do after that period of time was and we supported them with a reflective activity. So everybody was all in the kind of hall doing this same activity. And what they were asked to do was to bring some evidence with them from their own classroom. So it wasn't a research paper or anything like that. It was some evidence that would indicate what they had been doing and what impact it had had. Okay. So what we asked teachers to do was to share that piece of evidence with the person beside them and to describe how it had worked, kind of the pitfalls, the difficulties, and where there had been kind of perceived gains in the classroom. Now, this wasn't very scientific. It wasn't necessarily very objective, but it was kind of one step towards supporting teachers to think about the impact. And what we then asked them to do was we had a big graph, and across the bottom we had impact. Well, it was yeah, no, that's right. So across the bottom was impact on learning, okay, and we asked them to make a simple judgment from 0 to 10. So if they perceived that actually this approach in their classroom was having a significant impact on the learning, which was, so we gave them prompts about how they might judge that. It could be outcomes in test scores, it could be confidence of students to use technical vocabulary, whatever it might be, to write well, etc. So they had to make a judgment about learning on a simple scale of 0 to 10, and then we asked them to also think about the impact on themselves and their own time. So was this actually taking a lot of their time, or was this quite a time-effective approach? So whether it was their approach to differentiation, assessment, etc. And then we got them to plot these on one little graph for themselves, but then they ended up plotting it on a giant graph. And what we asked them to do as well was when they were making their judgment about the impact on learning, we asked them about how confident they were about that, what data they were drawing from, or what knowledge they were drawing on. If they were confident, we asked them to, we kind of gave them a system for signalling that. They used a little star. And so what we then did is we plotted every member of staff's kind of impact sheet kind of on this giant graph on the floor in our hall in the middle, which we then, so we took in kind of all the bits of paper, and then I was able to plot it on a general graph, which gave us an insight into, out of all the general approaches that teachers were taking to develop their practice, which one seemed more promising in terms of impact on learning, but also the confidence teachers had making those judgments. So we had some activities that looked like they were high on impact, low on teachers' time, but teachers weren't very confident making those judgments. So I couldn't be sure that they had really, they were really making a value judgment. Others, though, indicated quite a lot of teacher confidence, which indicated that they had been, perhaps more embedded in teachers' classrooms. Teachers were more confident about the outcomes for young people. And so we over the year we tracked, so we had 2 points at which teachers kind of tracked this, and we were looking at which activities were seen as quite promising. And that was one kind of data source which contributed to us developing our 6 aspects of teaching and learning. This year it's slightly different. So we are still going to kind of do like one of those at the end of the year, but in terms of supporting teachers along the way, we are supporting all teachers probably more carefully to track the impact on learners. So when teachers identify what they want to focus on, what they're actually going to do, we're going to ask them in their first session, well, how are you going to know if that's had any impact? What are you going to draw upon? Are you going to draw on students' outcomes? In which case, what's our baseline now? What might we look for at the end of the year? Some teachers are looking at sort of their classroom climate. So how do we assess that at the beginning of the year? How do we look at it at the end? So we're very much putting that into the hands of teachers, supporting them with tools to help them decide that. You know, I would love to say that impact is being measured by student outcomes, the number of, you know, 5 A-star to GCSEs that we have, but I just don't think that we can, you know, tie anything to that measure. There's a multitude of factors that affect student performance in my school, and I can't see the cause and effect. So although I think some people might quite like to hear, well, if you do this with your teachers and you support them in this way, results will go up by 5 or 10%. For us, that won't happen. You know, we're experiencing significant curriculum change. There's lots of factors that have been affecting our results. For me, though, one impact that I think perhaps is kind of overlooked sometimes by the literature or the educational press or school leaders potentially is the impact on teachers and their professionalism. Because what I'm really interested in, so I do work in a high-performing school. Like, I don't work in, you know, a really tough school. It's a lovely school. You know, don't get me wrong, there are excellent systems in place, and I think students do perform really well because of, you know, good systems, fantastic teachers, and fantastic teaching. You know, from my point of view as a school leader, one of my key priorities, even though it's not on my job description, is that we retain our teachers, because you know, I've seen in the last few years that trying to recruit teachers is so challenging. So if I can create a professional learning environment in which teachers actually feel nourished, and like going back to the quotation that I shared at the beginning, like we obviously got a journal which documents teacher learning, and it's, you know, gained quite high status within our school community. I'm not saying that's, you know, necessarily the be all and end all of things, but the fact that teachers feel professional and respected as teachers and as people that have knowledge and can build knowledge together, I think that's quite important. Now, I don't know if anyone can hold me to like retention rates in school, but I see it as a definite tool to enrich teachers' sort of professional well-being and support them to stay in school.
I should encourage you to access the Learning Journal because you're on your second one now. The second Third. I do have 2 copies myself. They're absolutely fantastic, and the level of engagement is just amazing by the teachers and the studies that they do. I believe you have a question, and then back to Simon. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Juliet McCaffrey. I completed a PhD here 3 years ago. I'm slightly marginally connected to university, which is how I know what is happening here. I have 2 questions. Actually, I now have 3, following on from your last question. They're practical questions. Is your learning journal on the web? Because that's very interesting. I'm also a school governor, and we're actually looking what you're doing at the impact. So I thought your whole idea was really marvellous. And we can find out about how you do it in the Learning Journal?
Yes, so the Learning Journal is on the web, and I can, I don't know, tweet a direct link to it, or, yeah, so we do, so it's like a PDF, and we've got the PDFs of the other one, so that is on the web. I do have like a page on our school website. Well, we've got a school website for Sandringham School, but we have an additional platform that we call Standardogy, which is like all our teaching and learning kind of CPD stuff. So there is a page, for example, from last year about the kind of different options teachers were focusing on. We have the examples of the graphs on there, so you can see, and there's the two of those that we collected last year and kind of a reflection on those. So I can tweet both of those links. And then you had a third question?
No, yes, my other question was slightly connected.
Yeah.
You are doing a PhD, so you have access to university journals,
Yeah.
etc., etc. How do the other teachers in your school who aren't linked to an academic institution get access to the learned journals?
Right.
Because
so,
it is very expensive.
yes.
Otherwise.
So, okay. So ultimately, and this isn't a great answer, but they don't. So if a teacher were, to say to me, can you help about X, then obviously I can look those up. That's not a particularly sustainable model. Our Research Advocates programme does try to do that. So teachers in the first session identify what it is they're interested in, and then the researcher that we're connected with will print off a few articles for them to have a look at. But again, that's not sustainable. So what I hope is quite promising about evidence for the front line is the idea that a researcher themselves will answer the question, and although they can't necessarily share research that's sort of behind paywalls, we've sort of developed a thing within our website where you can create a link to it, but there's kind of a summary, which is a bit like an abstract, but then there's implications for practice, so we sort of summarize what the implications might be. And I think potentially that has scope to share the outcomes of research in kind of a tangible way. However, it's not that tangible because it's only 32 schools and it's only in this year at the moment. But I think having something more systematic and kind of sector-wide, something like that, would be quite useful, because it's certainly a barrier I face at school.
I mean, obviously, open access issue is a massive issue, but I mean, there are ways of getting around it a little bit with academia.edu. ResearchGate is another one. ResearchGate is basically Facebook for researchers, and you can just log on and join that. So a lot of time, if they're out of their restrictions, a paper, for example, if it's 3 years, a restriction on a paper, I'll upload it as soon as that restriction comes off. You can also load up a version which is at the point at which you had it accepted to the journal, so you basically a working paper that's almost the same as a journal article. So those sorts of things are available. And the other thing is like Caroline's done, is just email people. You want a research article off them, just send them an email. They'll be flattered that you would like to read something, I'm sure. Yeah, I know, but if you sort of Google Scholar stuff and it throws up and you can't get a free copy, just email them, or see if they're on ResearchGate and things like that. But that's a great place.
Yeah, top tips there from Jill.
Simon.
Thank you. Thanks very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. And my interest, I've recently been doing some work with the university on research ethics, and in particular working with young people. And at the university we get very preoccupied with ensuring that any research we're doing in schools, and particularly those of our students, meet some quite strict criteria as to what we can ask of pupils. I just wonder how school-based research, because you're doing it better or more involved in it than most schools I've encountered, how you deal with the ethical side of what you're doing, particularly when you're using interventions with pupils.
Yes, so yeah, that's quite an interesting one. So I would say that I suppose it's interesting about interventions. So, for example, we've had teachers doing master's programs where they are, looking at, let's say, peer assessment, for example, and they're carrying out interviews with students, and they'll have kind of an ethical consent form that they ask students to fill in, for example. And I think just being aware of those kind of questions and pro formas and ethical guidelines from different universities is quite important. I think in terms of interventions, I think what I have experienced so far in schools is that due to practical constraints, it's quite rare that you're kind of able to have like two parallel groups that have kind of similar conditions, like similar teachers or similar profile of students within them, where you can kind of legitimately like intervene with one group and kind of not with the other. Because what we tend to find is that often students have different teachers, they're completely different, composition, like the students are completely different to one another in the different groups. So our ability to kind of carry out interventions in a way that we're giving one set of students a noticeably different experience to another is rare, stroke, like non-existent. So I would say, if you're in a bigger school and you had more money and able to like timetable things perfectly, I think it would be possible and practical and all that kind of stuff. I would probably say that perhaps this is not the answer you want to hear, but I would probably say we support teachers to develop their practice in an informed way. And I would say that teachers do that all the time. I would say that, teachers might develop their practice because, I don't know, students aren't doing very well, or students aren't behaving very well. And teachers just, as a matter of course, will alter their practice to try and enhance what goes on and the learning outcomes. I think what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to support teachers to just be more informed about that, so that they are able to potentially, stand on the shoulders of giants and to maybe act on evidence from academics or even from their own colleagues if they're kind of connected up and they share their practice, and develop that practice more effectively. I don't think that our school has made great leaps in terms of supporting all teachers to be researchers in the way that might require, ethical guidance and things like that. I would say for those teachers carrying out masters projects, then they will be doing that. But I think our school is still in the phase of practice development, informed practice development, for example. So I don't think I can honestly kind of help based on my experience in my school in answering that question. Sorry.
We might have time for one or two more questions. So I know this table hasn't asked one yet. Oh, very good.
Pressure's on.
Hi, my name's Ray. I'm doing one of the research leaders course here, the Masters. I have a question. It goes back to, you were talking about how your culture has changed for a CPD method in your school. How do you propose to keep the research you're doing in your school fresh and your staff motivated and senior leaders and on board? And what negatives have you come up against, and have you overcome those hurdles while setting it up?
Yes. So in terms of kind of keeping it fresh, like keeping people interested and things like that. So would that be like throughout the year or just like over time, or okay, both? Okay, so if I think about within one academic year, I would say we are supporting teachers to develop their practice. We're trying to give teachers autonomy. We're trying to support them to be informed so that they develop their practice over a year. I would say that all teachers are vulnerable to not prioritising that development and acting on that research or their reflections, whatever it might be. I would say there are just hurdles in terms of well, my experience is that teachers don't prioritise their professional development. I'm not saying that's in every case, but I would say that, the day-to-day demands of planning, teaching and marking are certainly enough to feel like, every hour in the day, assuming no sleep. So therefore, I can understand why teachers' priorities over their own development and their own focus that they might have identified can wane a little bit. So just simple structures, getting teachers to talk about their practice each time, getting them to like refresh what they were focusing on, designating them time to be able to work and develop and to share. So like kind of accountability structures throughout, but without kind of, standing over someone and kind of making them work. But I think being quite clever about providing time, but in a structured framework whereby there are clear outcomes for them and they've planned about what they want to look for, and being in a kind of a cluster or a group in which all of that is very visible, I think is quite important to maintaining interest and activity. And certainly this year we're developing teachers' kind of projects through Google Drive so that they're visible to other people and their own kind of CPD lead, and they can feed back on their work, for example. So we'll see how that goes, but I think kind of clever accountability and a very supportive way that supports teachers to prioritise their CPD, not because I assume teachers don't want to do it, but I do appreciate that there are pressures that are calling them to, you know, ring that parent or mark a set of books rather than spending a focused hour or two on their reflecting on their practice or developing their resources. I would say in terms of generally keeping things fresh within an institution, whether that's through CPD or kind of one-off events or, you know, over time, I would say it's worth thinking and sitting back and thinking what matters to people in this school. So, for example, last year we had a big drive on feedback, and our think tank about feedback was well attended. You know, because lots of teachers had experienced, you know, a session on our first day back in September saying this was a big priority for everyone. Through their appraisal process, dare I say it, everybody in the school had a target to develop and enhance the feedback they were giving to their students. And so therefore, when we hosted that in December, lots of people attended. I think that having the opportunity to meet people or Skype people in other institutions, whether they're just other schools or whether they're universities, I think there is an appetite for that. I think teachers like to be connected to people in the profession. And I would say what has been really powerful has been feedback from the research community. So in my school in particular, it's without question that, so for example, when we published our journal, or well, if I take that as an example, although it's not, you know, an academic tome by any stretch, you know, it's kind of a collection of teachers' reflections about their practice. Over time, more teachers are referencing literature, but it's not an academic text as such. I have sent it over the years to academics as well as school leaders and teachers, and they've come back and written some really nice comments about it, including Jill. And, you know, for teachers, you know, in a staff meeting when we have a launch of our journal, and to say that the Professor of Education at Sussex says this about your writing, or that, you know, a local head teacher says this about your writing, it does make people feel good. And these people don't lie. They've got no interest to kind of tell teachers in my school that they're great when they're not. You know, they've got their own kind of professional reputations at stake. But I think it kind of goes back to at the beginning. I think what I've definitely learned over the last couple of years doing my study for my doctorate is that teachers' kind of identity and their professionalism matters. And if you can kind of support that, if you can make it relevant to practice, and if you can make the experience of doing it, you know, important, then I think teachers and school leaders will take it seriously.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to call it a day there, because I just want to leave some time at the end in case people want to come up and just have a chat with Caroline. I want to allow time to do that. Can we thank Caroline in the normal way?